Hi, this is Lisa, and this lecture is on colonial America, in particular the Eastern Seaboard. And we have here the three sets of colonies: New England here, and the middle colonies and the southern colonies. Each one, of course, has a different lifestyle because the geography is quite different. In New England, the concentration, as we have seen, is primarily on shipping and trade, although certainly there are farms there as well. The soil is fairly sandy and porous. A lot of rocks need to be cleared to make a farm, a lot of trees. In the middle colonies, we get a mix of agriculture and trade, and in the southern colonies, because of the higher levels of rainfall and the excellent soil, we get a lot of agriculture, and because of the rolling landscape, fields can be very, very large and a great deal can be grown. Agriculture then is crucial, of course, to the success of the colonies, as we've seen with Jamestown. The agriculture throughout this region includes the production of wheat, livestock, particularly pigs for meat, pumpkins, squashes, those things that were native to the American continent are important foodstuffs. And in the Northeast, apples were one of the products. Now, all of these are used locally. None of them are exported. The exports will include non-agricultural products, particularly lumber that gets shipped back to Britain. However, there are cash crops, particularly in the South. The one you see here with the blue flowers is indigo. Indigo is a dye. It makes for blue and a very dark blue cloth. Very much desired, does not grow everywhere, needs a lot of water. Same thing with tobacco, which also needs a lot of soil fertility and was the first successful crop grown in British America. And particularly in South Carolina, rice. Rice production requires a great deal of water and a lot of labor. One of the things that historians like to do with the colonial era is look closely at the politics or at the economics or at the religion or the way society developed. And they like to separate the different cultures of the northern area, the middle colonies and the southern colonies. But I like to put them all together because all of it combined is what becomes what we know as America. So one way to do that is to look more closely at some commonalities, particularly in material culture. Material culture are the products. They're the things that are made or produced as part of any society. We call them artifacts when they appear in museums. Some of the items of material culture of colonial America are shown here, including a silver tankard. Silversmithing was a big deal, and we'll see a little bit about that in just a moment. Furniture manufacturing, furniture making by hand. This is a powder horn for use in war, of course. This is pottery. There was a pottery business here. A lot of pottery was imported from England, but some of it was made here. This one, obviously, because it's from the Revolutionary era, and it's actually protesting the Stamp Act. Spinning wheels and all of the gear that's needed for cloth production are part of material culture, and frequently these are passed down from generation to generation, which is why we get to see them in museums today. Other furniture, including the chair, which we're going to look at a couple of chairs in just a moment, also tend to get passed down from generation to generation. Artworks are material culture. They're of course artistic expression of a particular culture, but as objects they are material culture. This is a plow, sort of the kind of plow that would be used during colonial times. To take a close look at material culture is to develop a deeper understanding of the society. So we're going to do that in a couple of ways. Silversmithing is huge in colonial America. With access to New World silver and imported silver, it became possible with very high skill levels to produce exceptional silver products. You may already know that Paul Revere was a silversmith. It was one of the higher ranking skilled professions in colonial America, and they made beautiful, beautiful objects. This one on this screen here is one of my favorites because it's a chocolate pot and I love chocolate. And you'll notice the little chain and a stick at the top that makes it possible for you to keep stirring your chocolate without it getting cold. So let's take a look at how silver was made in colonial America by looking at this video clip from Colonial Williamsburg, which is a modern day reproduction, although some of their buildings are indeed original, of colonial Williamsburg, and they are very intent there on preserving the colonial past.
You got to push this down or the crucible will tip over and spill out all your silver. Silversmithing was a respected profession. Many silversmiths were trusted, sort of like bankers. Jewelry would have been probably the top thing that silversmiths would make, followed by spoons. When we make spoons in the shop today, you start by casting an ingot of silver, and then that ingot of silver is hammered out through a series of stages to slowly become the spoon blank. And then once the spoon blank is made, it is struck into a tin die with a steel punch to form the bowl. It's bent straight, filed up, and polished. When we're melting and pouring silver, it absorbs a lot of oxygen. And in its liquid state, it will hold up to 20 times its own volume in oxygen. If we don't do something to try to prevent the oxygen from being absorbed, or if we don't do something to remove the oxygen once it has been absorbed, you can see the oxygen burning off. When we pour the silver into a mold to produce something, the ingot will, as it cools, you'll end up with little air holes in the ingot itself. And this is a bad thing because when you hammer it into sheet, it's more flaky, and you want a solid piece of metal when you're hammering it. This hammer is called a forging hammer or cross-peen hammer, and this is the hammer that I use primarily when making spoons. This face of the hammer works like a wedge, so it moves through the metal in two directions, and then this face of the hammer spreads the metal out in all directions and helps, of course, to take out the sharp hammer marks made by this hammer. Customers would recycle their silver. Customers would bring their old silverware to silversmiths, be melted down and made into new things. Sort of an affectation of the rich. The rich had silver in part as a way to store some of their excess wealth. So if you had a spoon made of silver, you had a spoon made of money. We're using about 4 different polishes. The first polish we usually use is called water of air stone. It's a very, very fine abrasive. If things have little irregularities in their surface, this will level them out. Pumice takes out scratches made by the water of air stone, and it also will take out file marks and fine hammer marks. But it leaves scratches that are still visible to the naked eye. So these must then be removed with rotten stone. Rotten stone is a very fine abrasive that begins to leave fairly visible scratches. It takes out the pumice scratches, leaving scratches that are still just visible, but you do begin to get to see a shine on the metal when you're using rotten stone. And then the final abrasive that we use is Jeweler's Rouge. So Jeweler's Rouge takes out the scratches made by the rotten stone, and Jeweler's Rouge scratches are there, they're just invisible to the naked eye. So when you're done, your product ends up about as bright as that.
The next thing we're going to take a look at here are a couple of video clips. And both of them involve chairs. This is from a project called tangiblethings.org, where some historians at Harvard University got together to undertake an entire course about material culture, and they developed a video called "This Is Not a Chair," even though it obviously is a chair, The idea being that a chair isn't just a chair, it can be a number of things. So first we're going to take a look at how a chair can be evidence for the economy of colonial America.
This is not a chair, it's a commodity. A chair like this was not only beautiful, but it also required a vast network of commercial relationships to create it. It required craftsmen to produce it, many different sources for the materials that made it. A particular piece of importance is the mahogany. The mahogany was harvested in Brazil by slaves, transported across the Atlantic to where it was produced, and it was also very expensive. A purchaser of this chair would have not only been trying to purchase something that was beautiful to adorn their house, but also something that retained value, that could be traded and sold when financial times were less than ideal.
The next short clip will take a look at how a chair can document a working relationship, in this case pertaining to Thomas Jefferson.
This is not a chair, this is a document. In this case, it's a document of slavery. In the early 19th century, Thomas Jefferson commissioned this Campeche chair to be made by one of his slaves for him. This chair was built by John Hemmings, Sally Hemings' brother, and one of Thomas Jefferson's master furniture makers at Monticello. Jefferson commissioned this chair to be made in order to relieve his rheumatoid arthritis. Hemings' labor was literally used for Jefferson's own comfort, and this chair serves as a document of that relationship.
The slave trade was going on actively during the 17th and 18th centuries, and I want to take some time here to explore the ramifications of this for people coming to America with the slave trade. The slave trade had been going on in the old world, as they call it, for centuries and centuries and centuries, and I wanted to show you here in this map of Africa some of the patterns of the slave trade that existed in Africa before anybody came to the coast to look for slaves. These routes are from primarily this West African area, but you can also see other empires here. And in fact, the word empire is quite important. These regions that are marked in the colors are African empires. And as these empires expanded, an empire, of course, is a collection of kingdoms. So as these empires expanded and one kingdom would fight another, they would take prisoners of war. And it was dangerous to have those prisoners of war stay in the empire, and so they would trade them, often across these lines that you see here, across the Sahara Desert, many of them going to the north and from there up into Europe via Italy and Greece, but many more of them going eastward to these areas here of East Africa, which were really advanced civilizations and involved in the Indian Ocean trade, which is why you see more lines going out the coast there to Asia. All of these empires in expanding, slaves were a product, but they were also considered to be people. When slaves were captured as prisoners of war and sold, that was done, yes, for political reasons and reasons of social stability. It was also done to earn money. But primarily, these individuals were individuals. They had been captured in a particular war, and when they were sold based on their value and the skills that they had. Having arrived at their destination, let's say it's over here in East Africa, these slaves were then purchased by people who needed individuals with those skills. They remained a slave until they either bought their way out of slavery or they were freed by their masters. But no matter what happened, their children did not inherit that status. This was a status that lasted for that individual's lifetime. In East Africa and in some areas of North Africa, we know that slaves were treated fairly well. Often they were brought into the family. Many of them were skilled laborers. The life must have been terribly difficult. Having to leave your home is never easy. However, we do not see a whole lot of cruelty here in the system, however cruel the system itself may have been. Now, what begins to happen is you see the West African expansion that was going on into the 15th century had begun to die down, but there was still a lot of conflict in West Africa. These are the areas then that the transatlantic slave traders are going to get their slaves from. So these regions then of West Africa, where formerly these slaves would have been traded to primarily Muslim traders going across the Sahara Desert, either to the north or to the east, now they will be heading out on ships across an ocean. This changes the entire nature of the slave trade, and we're going to be looking at several clips from a film called The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, with Henry Louis Gates Jr., and this is the first one dealing with the sources of these transatlantic slaves in West Africa.
Black Africans. Africans practiced slavery long before they ever saw a white person. All across this continent, slaves were part of a system based not on race, but on ethnic difference and brute power. A system involving an enormous array of monarchs, merchants, and mercenaries.
African kingdoms were at war with one another. War was a theme in Africa and actually Europe as well for many, many years. And so as a part of these wars, as a result of these wars, people were taken hostage and made into slaves.
I've come to Port Loko, a river town in Sierra Leone, and the long-standing home of the Temne people. For centuries, the Temne here collected captives who had been taken in wars. They tied them, packed them into small boats, and sailed them downstream, where they were sold to Europeans for profit. We sometimes romanticize Africa. We think that Africa was idyllic until the white man came. But there were deep tensions between ethnic groups here. Black Africans didn't necessarily feel the bonds of skin color any more strongly than, say, white Europeans did.
Slavery was ongoing before the Europeans came. It was just a common business. They come here in this wharf. Here is the landing part for the boats.
Who were the slave traders?
The slave traders were great warriors, strong men, chiefs. They do this business.
A lot of misery loaded on these boats.
Yes, but our people, we are not thinking about misery. It was a lucrative business.
Mm-hmm. Assalamu alaikum.
Professor Gates.
I was surprised to find out that in Port Loko today, there are still many families whose ancestors profited from the trade. And some of them were willing to tell me about it. Good. Just speak from your heart. Did any of you receive wealth inherited from the slave trade?
Not 500 slaves.
500?
500.
My God, so he was very rich.
Yes, our people we are rich. Until the road account of Karam Masoing, then people saw ban or anti a cotego and Apagua are room bomiowi.
Would chiefs wage war just to get slaves?
Oh, yes.
nga mataka kalantaka e pinkar mabir mabang ka ambayang. Tsala prats fino e tseong e fino kar.
In America, we think black men were selling black people to the white man. But when you see it, do you see it as Temne were buying local, Mende were buying Temne, etc.? Is there a difference?
Well,
were all black people black?
Only BB.
It's true that black people are black.
So for certain team,
we don't speak the same language.
Saba lingati.
I don't like what you like.
Mas for certain skin is a pueblo man.
You know, we don't just live in harmony.
Though some find it difficult to face, the crucial role of Africans in the slave trade is now well documented. Historians estimate that the overwhelming majority of the slaves shipped to the New World were captured and sold by African kingdoms. But Africans did not invent slavery. It existed everywhere, dating back to the most ancient civilizations. Nor did Africans envision slavery as something that would be passed on from one generation to the next, something based exclusively on race. That was a European innovation.
Europeans had actually developed an idea over several centuries that they should not enslave each other. They could kill each other, torture each other, fight each other in wars. But Europeans did not enslave other Europeans because Christians did not enslave other Christians. The great advantage of Africans is that they were outside the European community. And so it was possible to use race as a way of providing a marker.
The Middle Passage was, for many slaves, the absolute worst part of their experience. It's called the Middle Passage for a couple of reasons. The older reason was the idea that you were captured from here somewhere in West Africa. You were traded across the middle of the ocean and you ended up somewhere over here. But economic historians see it rather differently. They see the Middle Passage as the middle part of the triangle trade from the European point of view. So from Europe comes textiles and rum and manufactured goods and these and books and things like that. These get traded to West Africa in return for slaves. Then the slaves get traded to the Americas, and they get there, the traders pick up their sugar, tobacco, and cotton and bring that back to Europe. There's profit in all sections of this trade, but it keeps a large economic system going, and slaves are part of that system. Now, as I said before, when they went across Africa, it was a very different sort of system than when they went across the Atlantic. Piling these people into ships with absolutely no regard for skill level or social status. In other words, kings and princes were chained next to ordinary people. People of different tribes and languages were crammed together with no respect for keeping groups, social groups, together at all in these ships. Utterly humiliating experience that has become part of African American cultural memory and heritage. The Middle Passage continues to be very important in American history. So another short clip again from the African Americans' Many Rivers to Cross.
In 1756, a British ship named the Hare set sail for Charleston carrying 80 African slaves. One of them was a 10-year-old girl. We don't know where she was from. We don't know her parents' names. But we do know the name that her master gave her, Priscilla. Priscilla was at the start of a journey that would change her life forever, the dreaded Middle Passage.
The entire experience is so horrific and so just brutalizing in ways that are just unimaginable for a contemporary audience. You have public floggings, you have decapitation, being immersed in your own bodily excrement. It is complete loss of control over your life in every way possible. Think about an 8, a 9, a 10-year-old. It is something that you're never going to forget, and it's going to be etched in your memory.
Women on the ship, even girls as young as Priscilla, faced an added danger. They were completely at the mercy of the male crew.
Women were considered to be available prey at any given moment for the entire ship crew throughout the passage. So some women would commit suicide. And some women did decide that I don't want to bring a child into this world. So they inserted some sort of piece of wood or nail or something to, cause violence upon their body. And you also find that some women would actually die from these attempts.
Priscilla spent 10 weeks on the ship. She saw 13 of her fellow Africans die along the way, their corpses thrown into the ocean. Death was so common on slave ships that sharks followed in their wake, feasting on the dead bodies. As the ship drew close to shore, the slaves were rubbed with a mixture of gunpowder and oil to make them look healthier, hiding the wounds from their beatings and chains. Then Priscilla stepped into a new world.
The last clip we're going to see here from Many Rivers to Cross has to do with the resilience of slave culture. Having survived the Middle Passage, those slaves who managed to survive life in America, particularly British North America, because that's what we're looking at, managed to create for themselves their own culture. There has been a tendency in historical studies for some time to see these people as victims, which of course they were. They were victims of the system. They were victims of the people who abused them. But they also had agency. They were able to achieve things. Culture, according to the video clip, is one of the things that they were able to achieve.
For nearly all African Americans, including me, our original ancestors will remain forever anonymous and invisible. This was not an accident.
Removing people from genealogy is very important to making a slave. So if I only call you by your first name and never by a family name, I'm indicating to everybody, right, that you have no family, right? You're just Jimmy, you're just Sam, you're just Sarah, right? So they'll occupy a station that everybody will publicly recognize is at the lowest rung of society.
Masters worked methodically to erase the identities of their slaves so that they would be more productive. And these tactics were quite effective. Slaves built this country. They built roads and bridges, factories and farms, towns and cities. But they built something else as well, something all their own, a culture.
As much as slave masters tried to control the worlds of their slaves, they were vastly unsuccessful. There was a persistence in history and culture and names that went across the Atlantic despite the best efforts of Europeans.
We tend to assume that the slave is a cipher, right? Because that's ideology. That's the ideology of slavery. That the slave is simply an extension of the master's will. That's the plan. That's the idea. But that's not really what you can ever do to a human being. Human beings always find a way to assert their own prerogatives. So black people create new kinds of cultural patterns that didn't obtain in Africa, that weren't those of the whites, but were something new.
Now, when it comes to looking at larger American culture and the slave's role in that culture, it is extensive. And it does overlap. Slave culture does not remain simply on the plantations or among enslaved people. It spreads to other parts of the culture as well. But all of the different groups that lived in America, whether they were free or slave, whether they were wealthy or poor, whether they were mixed race, whether they were unskilled or skilled or professional, all of these cultures combine to make American culture. So we have a number of examples here in addition to slave culture, as we saw in the previous video clip, sort of elite culture here of families who have their portraits painted and were very pious and noble and wearing wigs and that kind of things. We have mulatto families, particularly in the South and the southern cities like Charleston and New Orleans, who were mixed race and mingled at various levels with each other throughout the culture. We have farm people, women working, men working, people like Paul Revere, who were highly skilled, what we would now call middle class. He's holding one of the objects I assume he made of silver. Women like Phyllis Wheatley, who we're going to look at in the next unit, and she was a servant. We do have a large group of free black people who, during the colonial period, that was not considered particularly exceptional. There were free black people in both the North and the South. It is only as we move into the 19th century that the color divide becomes so marked that free black people will find serious difficulty functioning in society. During the 18th century, particularly at the beginning of the 18th century, that situation was much more fluid, and a number of free black families were highly successful as professional people and skilled people in their communities. So altogether, this is what creates colonial society. We have the objects, we have the experiences of the various people, we have the things that we studied in the last unit, and we have an amalgam forming, although certainly regional differences and differences in social status are quite extreme. We have the creation of something we could truly call American culture.